Hi, I'm Rebecca Noel. I'm the education reporter here at the Charlotte Observer, and I'm here with some of my colleagues just to have a conversation about Donald Trump's first 100 days of his second term as president and sort of how that's played out, particularly here in Charlotte. So let's start by just kind of going down the line, introducing ourselves. We'll start with
The political whiplash, you would say, of the U.S. trade policy has really been creating a lot of uncertainty for companies, large and small businesses here in Charlotte. The Wells Fargo and Bank of America economists have been saying that they think we'll go into stagflation, not necessarily a recession, but that still is uncertain at this time. Some of the smaller businesses like Modified Kicks at North Lake Mall, it's affecting his products coming in from China. It's also affecting their equipment if they have to make repairs, things coming in from other countries as well, the prices that he has to pay for those. And then you have restaurants like Famous Toastery that have already been dealing with higher egg prices now for a while. It's a Charlotte-based chain breakfast and brunch spot. So now they're seeing prices possibly going up on other products. And probably even more so than that, they're seeing consumer sentiment is falling. So they've seen a drop 15% on weekends, which is basically the bread and butter, in the number of customers coming in. So people are pulling back dollars because they're afraid of the uncertainties ahead. And then when you hit the larger companies like Lowe's in our area, Mooresville-based Lowe's and other companies, they're out on wait and see. And I think that's the biggest problem biggest issue that they're all dealing with, all these businesses, is they can't plan ahead because one day this is being the price or this is going to be price, and nobody's for certain yet. Some things are starting to come in now. And one of the things that some of them have talked about is like the restaurants, avocado prices or liquor prices, that things like that are going to go up. And they're going to do everything they can not to make it so that, the consumer has to buy it. But it's still just a wait and see.
I wonder if that's more for them to deal with, these business owners, than if it were just like a constant, like, we stuck at the 145 on China, the 145 tariff. I wonder if that's something they've talked about at all.
What?
Like the uncertainty of it, the fact that it's kind of fluctuating. What day we have this certain amount of tariff percentage in place, and then it switches.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest issue that companies large and small are having to tackle is it's hard to plan. It's hard to think ahead because even in the past 24 hours, not necessarily affecting us, but automakers, the tariffs on that have changed. So, they expect something and then it changes. Of course, they would like it if it rolls back, but the waiting and seeing is in uncertainty about it all it's playing out in consumer. It's playing out you and me. I know for myself, I'm rolling back on some things I spend on because I don't know what I'm going to have to buy later.
Another thing I was thinking about was, I know you did a package on particularly, the Trump administration has cracked down on diversity, equity, and inclusion programming and policies. And you did a package on kind of how Fortune 500 companies have been responding to that. Can you talk a little bit about what we've seen there?
Yeah, we looked at 9 of our Fortune 500 companies, and seven out of the 9 have rolled back on DEI verbiage or policy altogether. One, Honeywell, continues to use diversity, equity, and inclusion in its reports. Another one, Sonic Automotive, never used it to begin with. So the other 7 that have now changed it, and they still use language like inclusion, but they've dropped diversity and equity in most cases.
Mary, I was wondering about just in terms of some of the federal funding cuts that we've seen. How does that play out, particularly for nonprofits and just other places locally? Like, how have those federal funding cuts kind of trickled down?
Yeah, I'm going to sound a little bit redundant to what Key was saying, because I think it's also a lot of wait and see both in the municipal government sector and the nonprofit sector. there have been so many policies that have come down and they've been retracted, they've been changed, they've been challenged in court. That being said, there are already some tangible impacts. For example, Whiplash, which is pretty well-known nonprofit here in Charlotte. They do a lot of work with the homeless community. They get FEMA money and have regularly for a while support their emergency shelter. That contract is due for renewal at the end of April, and they really haven't heard from FEMA. And so they're hopeful that that will end up coming, but given all of the changes at FEMA, they can't say for certain. A lot of conversation around Social Security. I think that's one of those things that, again, it's frustrating, but it's hard to say. There were a number of offices, including some in North Carolina, on DOSH's closure list. It's still pretty uncertain whether that's actually going to happen. There have been some staffing cuts within the Social Security Administration, and what a lot of advocates who work with Social Security clients who need some help have told me is it's really going to make an existing problem worse. And there were already not enough Social Security offices. There were already not enough Social Security workers to take everybody's call. One advocate told me that in his experience, sometimes you'll call a local office and you'll sit on hold for a long time. And then all of a sudden you're talking to somebody in an office in Kentucky or Florida who can't help you because they're in a completely different state. So there's a lot of fear that those things are just going to get worse. Congresswoman Alma Adams held a rally a couple weeks ago now at a local Social Security office, and an employee who was speaking on behalf of a government employee union said that, they're having increased technical problems with their system in the office. And then because a lot of IT staff was cut, it's getting harder, it's taking longer to get those IT issues addressed. So it's a lot of different facets. Even if it's not necessarily people's checks staying smaller, these really tangible issues can still crop up, and they can still create a big challenge, especially for those people living on such a strict fixed income.
Ryan, I guess sort of a little bit of a segue here. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your coverage of, immigration. Like Donald Trump barged down a platform about decreasing illegal immigration. And what does that look like for us here?
Well, in the more immediate sense, I think something that a lot of people were paying attention to last week was we had ICE, and I should say ICE agents who were in plainclothes, the way people described it to us, who showed up at the Mecklenburg County Courthouse and arrested these 4 people. One of the things that's been difficult about reporting on ICE is when we're writing about the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department arresting someone, or the sheriff's office, or any law enforcement agency, we can learn kind of the story of what happened with that arrest, because it's public information, pretty easily. So we call up the police department and say, who are these people? What are they charged with? Tell us about the arrest. How did you find them? Why were you there? We have had trouble with ICE getting, I would say, pretty basic information. So we finally got the names after about a day, but a bunch of other questions around the circumstances of those arrests, we still don't have any kind of answers to. And I would say the reason I bring that up, I think that's typical, because 2 people we talked to about that were attorneys who work at the public defender's office, and they didn't even know that 4 people had been arrested. They knew of 1 because they walked out as it was happening. And there's just a lot of confusion. There's a lot of concern about how something like that is going to affect the county courthouse. Obviously, around the country, there's a lot of concern about people's civil liberties and concerns that they might be violated right now. Going back to funding cuts, the CCLA here in Charlotte, that's the Charlotte Center for Legal Advocacy, they represent a lot of low-income people and people who might not be able to get a lawyer in civil stuff. And some of the work they do is representing kids in immigration court. So you have a kid who, they're called unaccompanied children who came into the country, unaccompanied migrants. And what'll happen is, in one case that we're going to be reporting on soon, we've done some interviews and we're going to write the story, is there's a mother who came from a country in Latin America, and her kids, at the time 12 years old, caught up with her. About 6 months later, came by themselves via train into the U.S. And because in immigration court there's no guarantee of an attorney, including for children, nonprofits have been filling that in. So the Trump administration has cut funding to this bigger group that pays for that, and it funnels down to groups like the CCLA. And the CCLA is still doing some of that work. They get private funding and have talked about then we have to right-size some things. But the way they've described it is this sort of thing means that you could have a 6-year-old or any kid going into court and telling a judge why they should be allowed to stay in the United States by themselves. So that's one thing. We've also done some reporting on refugees who were going to come to Charlotte, in particular from Afghanistan and Pakistan, who the United States Refugee Admissions Program, the Trump administration's put it on pause. And so you have people, for example, who worked with U.S. forces during the war in Afghanistan, who through a special program ought to be able, typically, to come into the United States and get citizenship. That's on pause. There were people who were like maybe a week or 2 weeks or something like that from being able to finally get that stamp of approval and come in, and now they can't. So there's a lot of stories like that. The sheriff, this isn't necessarily new, but I think it's becoming more relevant now. Our sheriff, Gary McFadden, is still having issues cooperating or working with ICE, getting on the same page. And it all stems from, essentially, ICE wants Sheriff McFadden to hold people in the Mecklenburg County Jail for 48 hours so that people who don't have status, and they say who have committed crimes, so that they can take them through ICE's process and deport them. And the sheriff, and I think he's correct in saying this, is doing that as the law requires it. The issue is there's a communication problem, apparently, or a disagreement, where ICE wants a phone call where the sheriff says, we, in 48 hours, are about to let this guy out of the jail, come pick him up. And the sheriff does it through some other system, he sends over a notice, but ICE really wants that phone call. And right now there's a bill that was brought forward by the Speaker of the House here in North Carolina, Dustin Hall, that would require that phone call. But in broad strokes, the sheriff and ICE are not on the same page. With that, the only reason I think we knew about what happened at the courthouse initially with those arrests is because the sheriff was upset that ICE hadn't contacted him. And so he physically went out there and got into a discussion with them. And the subtext seems to be we need to be working together more. ICE, puts out these press releases that are very critical of the sheriff over the detainers. The sheriff then says ICE is not cooperating with him. And so it's just kind of this endless cycle where they're kind of working past each other.
Interesting. And I guess sort of in another matter of public safety, tell us a little bit about, the January 6th pardons and how that has played out for folks in our area.
Yeah, I forget the exact number of how many we had in North Carolina. There have been some standout cases. So one that I reported on happened out in Eastern Carolina with somebody named Matthew Bedingfield, who, to kind of give the brief version of the story, and this is his account of it, went to the Capitol, attacked cops, and did a Nazi salute, and said that he didn't really feel any regret on it. What's happening more immediately, so you have cases like that, is that people who were being investigated for other crimes and had evidence found through a January 6th investigation are now seeing there's potential that their cases could be dismissed. So we reported on somebody in the Charlotte area who had child porn charges, and they found that evidence because they were investigating him for January 6th. That case could be dismissed. He's asked for it, and there's some precedent for that kind of thing happening. Not with child porn charges that I know of, but in Florida, somebody with, I think, a gun charge had their case dismissed. So the pardons feels like forever ago, but it's still playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk a little bit about, education and sort of what we've seen happening. with that, a lot of it goes back to something that we've all said, which is basically it's uncertain right now. There's still a lot that we don't have answers to, particularly when it comes to K through 12 education. A lot of the questions are around federal funding. Pretty much everybody's probably heard of the fact that they want to, the Trump administration wants to do away with the federal Department of Education. And he has signed an executive order having Secretary Linda McMahon take steps to begin doing that, and they've cut a lot of their staff. In reality, they cannot fully accomplish closing the department without an act of Congress. So it still exists, and they would need Congress to actually get rid of it. But a lot of folks are wondering, because largely what the Department of Education does is funding. So there's the civil rights wing of the Department of Education, which handles, complaints of discrimination in schools and things like that. And then the rest of it basically has to do with funding, whether that's school funding, research funding, student loans, things like that. So the Department of Education they don't set a national curriculum. They don't do anything like that. A lot of what they do is funding. And about 90% of school districts in the country receive particularly Title I funding, which is for school districts with a large portion of economically disadvantaged students. So for example, in CMS, about this year, 105 of the 186 total schools in the district are Title I schools. So a majority of schools are Title I schools. Next year, it'll be 103 instead of 105. There are a couple that are dropping off the list, but still, large portion of the schools in CMS receive Title I funding. And so a lot of districts are sort of wondering, that funding's still in place, but they're wondering, okay, so we usually depend on having this federal funding. Is that going to come through? We don't really know. So in CMS, for example, they just finished their budget cycle, and they only allocated about 65% of the Title I funding that they expect to get. They only set about 65% of it aside, saying here's what we're going to do with it, just in case there are cuts to that funding. Also, we have cuts due to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, both in K through 12 education and in higher ed. CMS has lost a couple different grants that the federal government claimed promoted DEI. So that's they totaled a little over $6 million. One of them was for a teacher training initiative in CMS. So there's stuff that's happening because of specifically the crackdown on DEI. And particularly, the Trump administration required that every state, every school district that receives federal funding basically sign off on a letter saying that they are not violating the Civil Rights Act. And they included by practicing what they called illegal DEI practices, but it didn't really define what those are. So a lot of states, the question was, especially, a state like North Carolina, we have a Democratic superintendent of schools here in North Carolina, and then you have a Republican administration, and there were questions about how are those sort of political dynamics going to play out with that letter, especially. What Mo Green, the superintendent of public instruction here in North Carolina, ultimately did was basically say, yes, we can sign off on this letter because we are not breaking the law, but we're not going to change anything about what we're doing because we're already not breaking the law, basically was his argument. Thank you all so much for this discussion. I learned a lot. For all of these stories, check those off on charlottewithherber.com.